You wouldn't buy a car without a seatbelt, a laptop without Wi-Fi, or go a day without your cell phone. Could a business survive without the internet? Then why are many healthcare providers and provider organizations still not connected and enabled to share critical clinical information digitally in the care of your friends and family? Welcome to Kno2fy, a podcast from Kno2. Join host Dr. Peter Schoch, Chief Health Officer, and Therasa Bell, Founder, President, and CTO, as they bring the profound impact of healthcare communication to life through frank conversation in understandable language and through real-world context. They'll demystify interoperability, helping you unlock the potential of healthcare communication at scale. You'll also learn the transformative impact of being Kno2 connected. Connect, listen, transform.
Well, hello and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Kno2fy. Dr. Peter Schoch, your host, along with Therasa Bell. How you doing today, Therasa?
Well, other than just recovering from a major sneezing event that just happened, hoping it doesn't happen again, I'm doing great. Off about a week and a half of being a QHIN, and so it's been busier than it's ever been. So excited and doing great. Thank you.
I know our audience can't see it, but there is this continual glow just around you. In addition to the normal halo, there's this continued glow, which is probably a QHIN-related glow, I would imagine.
I think those are my wings that you're seeing.
It's hard to tell. It's very hard to tell. Well, I got to tell you, I'm looking forward to our episode today. We're going to talk a little bit about, I think we've been having a lot of conversations coming off of the QHIN designation that have been very important. We actually just did an episode with Dr. Kno2fy talking a little bit about the future next steps for QHIN, et cetera. And one of the things that you and I wanted to talk a little bit further about that we thought merited a lot of conversation, probably its own episode, was really around the idea of the adoption of interoperability. So whether it's TEFCA QHIN as a network, whether it's Care Quality as a network, whatever the network is, whatever the technology is underlying the network, the actual adoption by the end user of interoperability is critical to realizing the impact of interoperability that we all promise one another, right? Whether it's improved workflow, greater efficiency, better safety, better provider experience, et cetera. So I want to spend some time today digging in a little bit on what we think is necessary to drive adoption and what some of the common barriers to adoption may be, and maybe talk about how we overcome those barriers to adoption, and specifically probably end with what we are going to do as Kno2 to help overcome some of those barriers of adoption. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's really important because people, at least in the majority of the conversations I have that are about QHIN right now, the question I'm getting constantly asked is what's next? So now that you're designated, now what? And we're just getting started. To be successful, there's no guarantee of success with a designation by any of the QHINs. The guarantee of success happens exactly what you said. It is at the edge. The public in this case is going to determine the success. When I say public, provider community, payer community, and obviously patients being dependent upon both of those. That's who's going to determine the success of QHIN.
Yeah, what does success of QHIN look like for you? Not to say that as we are going to move to conversation about adoption, how we drive success. What does a successful QHIN look like under TEFCA 2 years from now, 3 years from now?
There's. I think everybody would give a different answer on this. Probably each one of the QHINs too would probably give a different answer. So this is very much of a T-Bell point of view, and has to do with why Kno2 was started and everything else. Success as defined, that as I would see it, is we've built a framework. We put the initial work of the technical architecture in place, but it's built out to cover all clinical workflows in a seamless way, meaning that the infrastructure supports all clinical workflows. We have workflows adopted by EHR vendors and available for adoption by additional ones. But we've smoothed out the wrinkles, the remaining wrinkles that we have to see bidirectional communication, clinical workflows between provider communities. When I say provider, it's a wide word, as we know, across the ecosystem, and the framework supports it. So we're just working through every clinical workflow that there is, and we're seeing exchange being used from the time that a referral, even in advance of that transition occurs, all the way through that patient being, through that release of that patient, discharge of that patient home, and then everything that happens before and after that. That we've built the framework out that it supports all those workflows. So that's one. And then I'll say the second one is a little bit more esoteric, is when it's not talked about anymore. When we're not talking about interoperability and as the interesting topic, and we're talking about the interesting topic are the outcomes to interoperability, then I know we've done our job and we're meeting success in the market.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the world of process improvement or monitoring a business, you think of these things as a physician with quality measures. There are process measures and outcome measures, and we talk a lot about process measures with interoperability. Outcome measures are exactly how is it impacting the cost of care? How is it improving the patient safety environment? How is it improving the outcomes for patients treated for diabetes? Those kinds of things. Love to get to those conversations as opposed to the how many people are connected, what's the percent of DSMs we're using versus facts, all those kind of things. I'll come back to in the main discussion something you said because it triggered a thought that I want to make sure we talk about that I thought was an interesting analogy. I will tell you that for me, I think I've declared this before, but I'm going to declare it publicly here. I think I'm probably a data socialist, and I don't know if I can say that, and that doesn't mean I'm for or against any political party. And I love my country, so it's not that. What I mean by that is I believe that every provider in healthcare, and again, I use the provider in the ubiquitous term, that it's anybody who's taking care of patients or part of taking care of patients. I want every provider to have the information and knowledge they need to provide the best care experience, the best clinical outcome, the best provider experience possible. And that to me will be successful interoperability. And I agree, at those stages, we won't be talking about process measures of interoperability. We'll be talking about the impact and the outcome. But to me, that's the key, is that give everybody the information they need to care for patients. Let us compete for what we do with that information, because that's what benefits the patient. And from a business perspective, what benefits the providers. If my business has the same information as the next business and a provider could work for either one of us, I'm going to want to do what I can to provide the best experience for that provider with the data I have, so that they can have job satisfaction and will stay with me, et cetera. If I'm a provider and another provider's got the same exact information I do, I want to compete over what I do with it for my patients and the outcomes for my patients. So that's why I'm a data socialist in that regard, just to be clear, using that somewhat tongue-in-cheek term. So when we come back, we'll go ahead and talk about that, get right into discussion. There are a number of key things that I know you and I have talked about before that we want to bring to light here and just share with the audience, more than anything to be thought provocative, and then conclude with some thoughts around how Kno2 perceives and is going to break down some of those barriers for interoperability moving forward. So we'll be right back.
Discover the untold stories of the talented mind shaping Kno2. In this employee spotlight, delve into the journey and passion that fuels our team.
Hi, I'm Eric Nichols. I'm a solution architect at Kno2, and what I kind of do on a day-to-day basis is I help our customers and partners realize the full potential of using Kno2's API. Help them see how it incorporates to their products and how it can be used to foster communication. I also help with internal processes with automation and other things as well. So I kind of do a little different things here and there.
So what is your why for working at Kno2 or in healthcare in general?
I worked in healthcare since I graduated college. I have always kind of gotten a drive out of knowing that what I'm doing is indirectly helping patient care. And knowing that I'm helping clinicians provide that care, that's what gets me excited. I've had in our family, health issues where different, things, could have made things better if communication was readily available, but it wasn't. So
Absolutely.
it's nice to know that I'm making a difference.
What is the most unique or unusual job you've ever had before joining Kno2fy?
Probably a lot of people don't know. I used to be a river guide, rafting
What?
down different rivers in Idaho. So the Snake River and Hell's Canyon, as well as like the Middle Fork of the Salmon. So we would take a lot of clients from all over the country or even the world. Like one trip in particular was a lord from England was on the trip. So
If you were a condiment, which condiment would you be?
probably mustard or something.
All right. Share a funny or interesting talent or hobby that most of your colleagues might not know about.
It's a tough one because I think everyone knows what I do. I have 2 kids, so that's pretty much my hobby is keeping. I don't know. Occasionally, my friend and I like to go shoot clay pigeons. That's something that I don't really share out very often.
All right.
Yeah, it just gets us outdoors doing something.
Stay connected for more behind-the-scenes narratives as we continue to unveil the stories within our remarkable team. Connect, listen, transform. This is Kno2fy with your hosts, Dr. Peter Schoch and Therasa Bell.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Excited to continue this conversation. And Dr. Schoch, I think you said something I triggered you, is the words that you used, but I apparently asked a question before we left for break that triggered you. So would love to understand more about what I'm doing.
Let me just.
Let me learn.
I appreciate that, but let me recharacterize. You didn't trigger me; it triggered a thought.
Okay.
It was interesting when you were talking specifically about the workflows and that interoperability be built out for every workflow in healthcare. It's interesting because it's not too different in my limited understanding of the work that you were part of and that other folks were part of in building out what are the critical requirements for the CDA, right? And the data library, right? And the discrete points. What they did was say, hey, in a discharge summary, these are the important elements of a discharge summary that need to be communicated. What we didn't then do is say, okay, how does a provider digest a discharge summary when they receive it, and where does it need to go in the electronic health record, and what workflow needs to be driven off of that, right? So to your point, we've got all these standard data sets that we consider important, and they were informed by many thoughtful people, some clinicians, some non-clinicians, et cetera. How do we now take the data sets that we thought were important, that we're now transmitting across networks, and actually build the workflows that take the data and put them in the usable format so it becomes information and knowledge for doctors? That's what was that's what the thought that was triggered when you were saying that built out workflows. And I'm not even sure I'm technically savvy enough to know if that analogy works, but it sounded similar to me.
Oh, it absolutely works. I'll reference, and we had talked about it in last week's podcast, that there's 3 phases of growth that Kno2fy had outlined. We would never leave a phase, but we would emphasize a phase. And connectivity, it's connectivity workflow analytics, right? And we look at connectivity will never cease in connecting, because there's additional opportunity, tons of opportunity. Obviously, QHIN being a massive one, and a foundation for sharing information, a framework, if you will. And as we've already made the transition, but we're very focused to workflow. And our definition of workflow is inverted. I always say it's inverted from how an EHR provider, for instance, if we narrowly focus this conversation to electronic health records, to how an EHR provider thinks about workflow. When we talk about workflow as a QHIN or as a network of networks, we're really about taking common workflows in healthcare, and then we'll get to the less common ones as we work our way through it, and making sure that we streamline, like, let's say, for instance, a referral workflow. We streamline it in the fact of, we know where all the referrals are coming from. We streamline it, we identify it, we tag that particular transaction when we're moving the data, that this package that I contain here is for a referral, and we put more information around it. So when I hand it to an electronic health record, they don't have to worry about opening up the package. Like if you think about how FedEx works or UPS, they're shipping. If when it went through the different shipping areas across the United States, somebody had to open it up to figure out now where to send it. That is exactly what we want to avoid. So as Kno2fy thinks about workflow and what we're going to do to complement what an electronic health record does is all about identifying transactions more intelligently. And so the EHR can say, yep, I got a referral. I know I'm getting a package for a referral here. Here's some attributes around that referral that make it easy for me to consume, no matter how that referral came out of the source system, whether it was faxed or doesn't matter. I'm going to take this referral and do something with it. That's how we look at workflow. So when I look at what the next step is for QHIN, what we're doing with the other QHINs, there's some very fundamental pieces. We put in what they call the QTF, not to get too technical here. And it was just the technical framework. It says you have to be able to push a transaction, you have to be able to go query for something, and you have a directory. You got to be able to make inserts. Well, I can guarantee you that that's a rough start, right, to what it needs to become. So as we look at workflow opportunity moving forward as QHINs, so what's next for us is to dig into those. Dig into what is a push, for instance, if I push something to another QHIN, what am I pushing? What's the intelligence around that transaction? What should be done with that transaction when I hand it to the QHIN and they hand it to their edge? What should be happening to create the baseline? So we've connected, the electricity's flowing. Now I'm going to route the electricity in the right way, do the right thing. That's the next level of workflow that we need to support. So when I talk about what success look like, is that we're successful in our ability to support any type of clinical workflow that may happen on the edge, that it's smart enough, the intelligent infrastructure is smart enough to handle no matter what information's passing or what the transaction is, whether it's a prior authorization, it's a referral, it's a care plan signature, whatever it may be, that we have the right infrastructure in place to be able to handle all those workflows, because that is not how the networks have been built. That is where we have failed historically. We have put in the technical pieces, but we've not refined for workflow. And that is where we've not seen adoption.
You stimulated another thought in me, or an epiphany in me, that I think we're using workflow in two different ways. I hear what you just described as common workflows within the constraints of the technical framework around how we exchange information and how information is delivered. I think there is an additional, and maybe it's worth breaking out, the clinical workflows, which to some degree will have some bearing on the workflows we build in how we share information, right? Because at the end of the day, understanding how a clinician uses information or needs to see information is important, not only for the EHR provider to build workflows in their EHR that incorporate that information, but it may also have some dictate as to how the information is received, what particular pieces of information are delivered, et cetera. So it's funny because I'm sitting here and you and I have talked about workflows all the time. We've talked about the 3 stages of growth in the company of connectivity, workflow, and analytics, and how it's a loop, and that the analytics around what's going on what's happening through the network and use rates through the network help improve to intelligent connectivity, transitions to intelligent connectivity, and improve workflows within the network. But there's this whole workflow on the back end that's important on the clinical side, that it has to have bidirectional influence. It influences our workflows across the network, and our workflows in the network influence the ability of our EHR partners to build the clinical workflows on the back end. And I think as we're talking about this, the audience can't see me. I'm getting somewhat animated because there's an epiphany going off here, and Trace is probably going, "Duh, Dr. Schoch, this is." Yeah, that's right. I wish they could see your face. No, but I think it's a message as we look to crack the nut around adoption. I think it is a critical piece that I don't think a lot of people clearly understand, the interplay between the two, the interdependency between the two. And I think at times we're working on different parts of them in isolation, and you really can't.
Yeah.
You really can't. Which gets to some of the things that we're thinking about and how we work on them together, so that they're not separate entities, meaning clinical workflows, EHR responsibility, and network workflows or information workflows.
Well, if you take, and I try not to go too technical, I think this podcast will be a little bit more technical than the other ones.
I'm going to have to come up with an alert for when I get too clinical. We'll have an alert that says, public service announcement, there's going to be a clinical conversation, or public service announcement, we're getting really techie.
If you take what we did in HL7 V2 messaging, and for the audience that doesn't really know what that means or has heard of it, don't really understand.
Which would include me.
It was, you take like the lab order result interface, right?
Yeah.
A provider in one system could fill out a lab order, complete a compendium and fill out a lab order. And that would be formulated in literally a text file that had all this information in it. Who is the patient? What's the order for? Just all this detail, right? That file would be submitted to the receiving lab information system, and they would parse the order apart, and it would work. But in that file, it contained not only the information on who the patient was and the detail on the order, it gave enough information about the transaction that the lab information system knew what to do, who to process it for, to complete the entire workflow, right? It could complete the entire workflow to hand back then the result. And in the result, there was enough information in the lab result that the receiving system back knew what to do. Do I have an out of range? What do I need to do to invoke a workflow in my system all the way to the edge? And I use that example to say we knew how to do that in HL7 V2 messaging, but it took so much work that it never saw scale, right? So everything was point to point to point to point. So we have to really, I always say, and the team hates it when I say, we really have to think differently when we're talking about driving data communication at scale. You don't have the luxury of fine tuning a transaction like that over and over and over and over and over again, point. You have to look at it at mass and say, okay, how do we break it down into its parts? And so we talk about we can't have one without the other. Yes, that is true. Ultimately, it is not true to start with. We had to build out the framework of what we did. So what was put in place with the QTF, the testing that went on in place just to push and pull between each other, if you will, between the QHINs, that needed to happen. And now we're moving into, okay, we know we can push data between each other, we can pull data from each other. Now what are we going to wrap around it and make it more and more and more intelligent to support that long game of what we used to do in HL7 V2 messaging, where I'd complete an entire workflow. Now I'm breaking it down into its parts to build on it, to get to that scale level. Now I don't have to do it point by point or workflow by workflow. Hopefully, I know I got technical there, but it's I think really important for people to understand the process that's in front of us.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I'm waking up from my slumber, I'm just, no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah, I think that's helpful. I heard a couple things in there. There is a homogenization that probably has to occur in some of the way we use information on the system of record side, right? That everything custom is, and this is a tough thing in healthcare for providers too, right? Standardization, the word standardization. I cannot tell you how many times in my career as a provider and as a executive trying to lead change in healthcare systems, how the word standardization was railed against because it seemed to be antithetical to the autonomy that a provider felt we had related to decision making and commensurate with the responsibility that we bore for the decisions that we made. However, I used to say that where my autonomy as a provider was greatest and unquestioned in how I interacted with a patient, how I performed my physical examination, my history, how I processed clinical information to make decisions, and how I communicated those clinical decisions. So everything that happened in the exam room on a phone with a patient. Those things were my autonomy. That was the way I did it, the way I practiced. As soon as I stepped out of my exam room, I now was in shared space with other providers, right? With shared staff with other providers, and now shared health systems of record, shared. So all of a sudden, I can have some input, but I'm not completely autonomous because every other provider in my office is using the same space, same staff, same supplies, and same equipment that I am, same electronic health record I am. So we have to come to some standardization, right? So this idea that standardization threatens autonomy, throw that out. I think we have to define what autonomy really means and where autonomy is important. Secondly, I think the idea that standardization is the death of individual personalized care is also something that we have to address up front for providers. And the reason I say that is because standardization of practices, processes, way of looking at things allows us to vary where there is need to vary. It also makes sure that we're delving in as deeply as we need to in everybody, regardless of the things that might differentiate the care we deliver, such as health disparities, health equities. We're digging in the same way for everybody. So standardization is beneficial in overcoming health equities, in improving patient outcomes, and also in identifying the areas where we absolutely need to vary. And I think the same thing is kind of true with data exchange and electronic health records and workflows there. There are things that are going to have to homogenize, I would imagine, in how we process information that's exchanged across networks. And there are processes within the networks that are going to have to homogenize. And there are going to be some places where we can customize, but it'll be the key places that we need to customize for the right thing. Anyway, maybe it's an analogy as a provider that doesn't make much sense in a technical world, but when you said those things, it really reminded me on the provider side of some of the challenges we face there from a change management perspective around these things.
Oh, I think it completely relates. And I would encourage, as much as I talk about the need for workflow and standardization to support, we need to do what is necessary and not anything more. In terms of the QHIN to QHIN, not anything more to make sure that we have the flexibility.
Yes.
So unlike the example I just used, where I will oppose the example I just used based on what you just said, that HL7V2 message for lab order results could only be used for that. It couldn't be used for anything else, any other type of transaction, and that's okay. But that's also why it didn't meet with scale, and that's it. That is the problem statement now QHINs have to get their hands around, is building enough intelligence in the transaction, but just enough that it allows for the flexibility on the back end and not define it to the end of the earth. And that is that next level. And you said it much more articulate, much more real example of our next responsibility is to figure out how to build intelligent frameworks. Still stick to a framework. It's not a playbook all the way to the end. It's a framework. Now put some intelligence in it, but to give even more flexibility and use than what it had in its very base format that we started at.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that you and I were talking a week or so ago, right around the QHIN designation, and I said to you that I think we need to morph the conversation now just from connectivity to intelligent connectivity, and that's what we're about as a company, creating that intelligent connectivity, and that's the result of analyzing workflows, transactions across the networks, and so forth, so that we can build intelligent connectivity. And again, the value of that from an adoption perspective, to bring us back to that concept of adoption, the value of that from an adoption perspective is we're more likely delivering a payload to an end user whose system of record can do something more agilely with it that actually drives the impact that we're hoping for from interoperability. That's the benefit of intelligent connectivity, right? It's I'm trying to think of an analogy related to electricity because we've used that analogy a lot. But what if your electricity wasn't regulated and you plugged into one outlet and it was 220 and you plugged in another out and it was 110 and they weren't labeled for different purposes? They all had the same plug. You'd be short circuiting a bunch of things, right? So to be able to have intelligent connectivity where there is some workflow regulated impact across the network is important. And then it allows the flexibility of what the appliances do on the back end.
I think this is where no matter what example we use, like mobile or power grid,
Yeah.
all of them fall short to
Yes.
what
Yes.
in healthcare. It's a great word picture, right? It helps those that don't want to spend any time here or don't care to spend or have a day job and they're not doing this every day. They all fall short, right?
Yep.
Because
Agreed.
what we're doing, it's like there's not different forms of. I'm sure somebody. Now I'm going to say this. I'm going to get all sorts of feedback. Yes, there is, T-Bell. There's not different forms of electricity, right? And what we're talking about is there's different forms of data being used. There's different information being used. It's coming, and so we have to create more intelligence around it to allow for it to communicate and allow that edge system to just do what they do really well. If you look at, we can simply reflect the history and say meaningful use, all these things that yes, absolutely drove change. And I'm the first one to say they were the best and the worst thing that's happened to us. If you can allow those two opposing ideas to occur. But meaningful use in the attempt to drive just electronic health record adoption has done an amazing thing to do that, right? But it also created really bad behavior in the technology vendors because what they were focused to is checking the box and being able to connect. They weren't focused to the workflow. For instance, like I'll pick on direct secure messaging. Huge opportunity to move everything off the fax machine, but people were just checking the box, right? And so the workflow experience the providers had in their own electronic health record, it didn't incent adoption. And so just like, in our previous podcast, it was not easier than fax, so I'm not doing it. Until things are easier than fax, I'm not going to do it. So that was a big tangent. My apologies, but
no, not a big tangent at all. And while you were on that conversation, I took the advantage of using Dr. Google and just checking about the different types of electricity. And there are two types of electricity: static and current electricity. And then current electricity can be delivered in DC or AC. So again, I think there are just in case anybody was. I did Google that. Yeah. I did. So yeah. Anyway, I think you're right, and I think the point is the point is really valid. Let's come back a little bit more to the adoption piece again and talk about it. So I think if I heard the synopsis of our first part of the conversation, it's really around intelligent connectivity that's based upon certain workflows that deliver a payload that is more readily digestible by the edge, meaning the EHR on behalf of the providers. And the workflows in the network around that delivering that payload need to be somewhat informed by the clinical workflows we're trying to influence and we're trying to get that data into. The edge needs to build workflows in the EHR using the informations delivered that drive the clinical workflows, right? That support the clinical workflows. That's a huge piece for adoption. And it's dependent upon, as I see it in that equation, a number of key stakeholders, right? It's dependent upon the networks. It's dependent upon how easy is it to get connected to a network? What is the payload being delivered by that network? It is dependent upon the EHR in terms of what is their capacity to drive changes and to ingest information coming in different formats to relevant pieces of information in the EHR for the physician's workflow or the provider's workflow. And it's dependent too, and I'm not going to let my colleagues off the hook here. It's dependent too on providers. It's dependent on providers to withstand the change management necessary to change our behaviors in how we utilize information. And that's huge. That's huge. And I'm not sure, without talking about it directly, that we can ever hope to overcome it. And we had the podcast with Ivy Rehab and Marla Ranieri, and I think she spoke to this point to a degree. You and I have had multiple conversations with other EHR partners with their clinical representatives, and have this conversation's come up. I think most recently in a medication reconciliation manner with one of our partners. It is an unbelievable barrier to overcome to getting interoperability adopted at scale. And it's one that we as providers, and again, the large term providers, not just doctors, nurses, but everybody who's on the front lines delivering care, utilizing the information, whose workflow is impacted, We need to withstand the change management necessary to incorporate it into our practices if we're actually going to see the impact of it. And I do know what I'm saying, what I'm saying when I say that, because many times on the front line, whether you're in a hospital, whether you're in a practice, whether you're in a home care agency, change management takes time, disrupts current workflows, threatens short-term revenue sources, revenue streams, et cetera, and can be very, very disruptive. But we're going to have to withstand some disruption in order to realize the long-term benefits, the near-term and long-term benefits of interoperability at scale. And when I say that, I also say we can do our best on the network side, Theresa's QHINs, to reduce the disruption that occurs by creating intelligent workflows and intelligent payloads. And EHRs can do their role, play their role in reducing disruption by creating workflows that are around the clinical outcomes that need to be achieved. But there is going to be disruption. And we just, as providers, guys, I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, we have to be prepared to do that. To come through the other side. So anyway, that's my soapbox to my colleagues on the provider side. There's a role we need to play in this process, and it can't be constantly, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't have time to do that. That's going to disrupt my office, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to see it for what it is. It is the way out. It's the way off the treadmill of increased administrative burden. It's the way to improve value-based care performance and gain entree into practice transformation. But you've got to be willing to see it for what it is and withstand the discomfort. And I use this analogy all the time, and you hate it. So caution, clinical analogy coming up, and that is an abscess. Nobody wants to go to the surgeon with an abscess for two reasons. Number one, we're all embarrassed that we have an abscess. But number two, we know that the surgeon's going to have to stick a scalpel in that thing, cut me open, express it all out, dig around and break up any loculations, and then pack it so that it doesn't, and let it heal from the inside out so that it doesn't recur. And that is a painful freaking process. But at the end of the day, the abscess is gone. Right? So sometimes there is pain we need to go through to get to the other side. And this pain that I'm talking about for providers here is the change management process and short-term disruption to business model or to workflow or to lifestyle, et cetera. And I'm not saying it lightly. I went through it as a provider, led through it as an executive. It's not easy. I'm not underestimating that, but it's an absolute necessity to get to where we want.
I think we can go ahead and close the podcast. I think the entire audience just heard. You just lost your entire audience in that very disgusting.
I said caution, clinical. Hide your babies, hide your kids. You know, it's
I do appreciate the call out to the provider community. I personally feel it's largely the responsibility of the QHINs and the HIT vendors, but absolutely there's change. And the provider, I was on a panel, you may not recall this, I was on a panel here last fall, and one of the questions that came from the audience in expectation of QHIN was, and they were a provider in the post-acute industry and skilled in particular, what should we do differently, or what do we need to do? So I really appreciated the fact that they were ready to tackle it. And my response back to them is, you have to lean in. You have to lean in. You can't wait for perfection to show up at your door. One, because nobody knows what perfection is. And so to wait for it, as HIT vendors and as QHINs, we have a decent idea, but nobody knows what perfection is. And perfection is a constant pursuit. So you have to lean in as a provider to get the technologies adopted in your organization, get the use of it, and then start giving feedback to your electronic health record vendor or your HIT vendor, whatever it may be, saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if, or it would be better if we could do it this way, and give that feedback. So that's how products should be developed. It shouldn't be developed by regulation. It shouldn't be developed by these forced events that are occurring. It should be developed from user feedback. It should be developed through innovation to the edge audience. And let's put that circumstance in place, but it absolutely requires the provider to lean in and adopt the technology.
You just said something that struck me too as another potential barrier to adoption that I think we need to address. And again, as we close the podcast, we'll talk a little bit about how we're planning Kno2 to do some of that, addressing those things. But another barrier in my mind, and part of the reason that change hasn't occurred at the edge, is because, and why it's taken regulatory acts and incentives, is because people don't feel the impact of interoperability in a financial way. It hasn't been translated that way. It doesn't feel real. But let me tell you something, provider turnover, and again, provider in the big broad sense, right? Anybody who's on the front lines. Provider turnover has a cost to your business. And part of provider turnover, it may not be the only, it certainly isn't the only reason, and it may not be the biggest reason in your institution, but a common large reason is the administrative burden that providers face in trying to do their job on a daily basis. You can reduce that and therefore reduce turnover and increase job satisfaction. That is real ROI for a business. All of the workflows that involve securing revenue in some of our providers that we think about, think about referrals. If you're somebody who's dependent upon referrals, the faster, more effective, more efficient you can make the referral process, the more capacity you have to take in new business, right? So optimizing your revenue streams. So these things need to be translated into things that business people and providers understand, so that the impact is felt. Because I think that's one of the barriers over the years of interoperability is, and you've heard me say on this, and I perseverate on it to some degree, probably much to your dismay, but interoperability is a technical phenomenon, right? It has technical components. You can't do it without having the technical connections, having the technical frameworks, and so forth. But it's not just a technical problem. It's a business problem. It's a healthcare problem that has real cost associated with it, real benefit associated with it, and a lot of technical implications. And I think that translational difference between the technical component and what it really means to businesses, healthcare providers, et cetera, is not recognized very well. So I think that's another barrier to overcoming adoption. One last thing that I think is let's take just 1 or 2 more minutes. Any last thoughts on other barriers to adoption? Then we'll take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll wrap up with some thoughts we have about what we're going to be doing as Kno2 to help drive adoption forward on the edge.
I will say that there's been one, and they kind of go together, but it's oddly enough is just simply awareness of capabilities of my training partners. So the directory, being aware that in my area, and at a certain point, this is where if interoperability is not talked about, it means everybody's adopted it, right? Or the large portion of people have adopted it. But today I have to know if you've adopted it. So that awareness of, hey, I have 15 different referral sources. I don't know if they're capable of sending me things electronically. And then the inverse of that is the referral sources don't know if, let's say, like a post-acute provider is capable of receiving it. So that awareness and solving the awareness problem is absolutely a friction point. Getting a national directory that actually works. This is one that we've attempted many times and it's failed. We've got to get it right this time. So we know how to communicate. The awareness of how to communicate is really important. It's like, it's like knowing everybody's email or knowing everybody's mobile phone number.
Yeah.
We got to get ourselves around that because it's absolutely a barrier to broad adoption is the awareness, just simply awareness of capabilities of the folks that I coordinate care with the most in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I'll put a warning for a shameless plug here, but one of the ways to get started with that while we're working on the directory stuff that you're talking about, which is a much bigger undertaking, is a connectivity report that you can go to our website, Kno2.com, and find out who in your markets are connected and what type of exchange they're capable of. which would enable you to start the conversation if you're interested in saying, hey, okay, uncle, I want to get connected. I want to get connected. Who am I going to be able to exchange with? Who am I going to be able to do business with differently? Go to Kno2.com, click on connectivity report analysis. It'll allow you to put in your zip code, your name, and email address, and it'll run and tell you who's connected in your area. And you can run that list and say, hey, this is a practice that sends me 20% of my referrals, and they're able of communicating digitally. Now I can get my referrals. If I connect, I can potentially get my referrals digitally from them. That's a great place to start, because then you know how to have a conversation there. You know the value of it to your business. That's a great place to start. I think you're right that it'll get a lot better when the directories are up and running and complete in their new iteration. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll wrap up and leave you with some parting thoughts and what we think we're going to do. Thanks. Be right back.
Uncover the narratives that fuel Kno2's success on the Employee Spotlight segment of the Kno2fy podcast, where we delve into the unique stories and passions propelling our team forward.
Can I have you state your name and title and what you do for the organization?
My name is Kno2fy Lawless. My title is Program Director with Kno2. I do a little bit of everything, help in any way possible, no matter the team or the person, but a lot of facilitation and helping to organize meetings, helping to just bring people together to accomplish the goals.
What's your why for working at Kno2 or in healthcare technology in general?
I can't believe I'm as old as I am, but has been in healthcare for many, many years now. My passion has always been related to healthcare. Started out in school thinking I was going to be a pharmacist and kind of changed gears and started learning about electronic health records. This was back in the day. I started my career when everything was paper. And was doing some research and learning about the possibilities that were to come in our future. And that's where the technology mixed into my career. So I focused in on what used to be medical records, now health information management, and started out, of course, in the beginning stages, file clerk. But then as my profession and career grew, I kind of grew along with technology and the advancements in technology. And I just couldn't be happier to be with Kno2 in this stage of healthcare advancement in technology, to be able to apply all my experience from the past related to patient health records and easing the pain points, getting information for those records in the hands of the individuals that are caring for our friends and family, for the patients. And so it really tied in so nicely technology into my passion. And then Kno2 is just taking that a step further. So it was electronic health records. I was able to work for a local health system and implement an electronic health record. And what a journey. The things that I learn are just invaluable. And now with Kno2, we get to take it a step further. And so it's taking all of the advancement in electronic health records and allowing those different vendors and those different technology solutions to talk to each other, bring people together, and make information available, like I say, to those that need it most, those that will make the difference in the lives of our friends and families, to help them be healthier and help them solve any health problems they may be dealing with. So, yeah, it all ties together, and I couldn't be happier to be with Kno2.
What is your favorite utensil?
My favorite utensil. Oh, my goodness. That is a challenging one. Let's see. So I would probably pick Gosh, it's between the spoon. Like, you mean like an eating utensil?
Yeah.
I would pick probably the spoon or the fork, and I think I'm going to go with the fork. The reason why is the fork is very much like a spoon. So you can scoop up most things, but as well, the fork allows for when you're trying to bring those things together on a surface, the fork allows for that additional like you can stab things to grab things, where a spoon gets harder, but it still facilitates like bringing things together and making them available to wherever they need to be, whether it's on another plate or in your mouth or whatever.
I love that. Maybe we should make sporks more normal.
Right, that's the solution right there.
What is your all-time favorite movie and why?
Oh, I know. So, gosh, I have a couple that stand out to me, and they're similar. 51st Dates and The Wedding Singer. And I probably would say 51st Dates. What I love about that movie is just the pure happiness. I love where the movie takes place in Oahu, in Hawaii. It's such a beautiful place to be. And the plot and the story of it is of an individual that has a traumatic event where her life course changes unexpectedly from an accident and a brain injury. And then the course she takes on just memory issues. So it relates to my passion of healthcare and the journey that sometimes life presents for us, and then how successful she is in her life and with her loved ones, and just still being able to be an educator, have a family, even though every day she wakes up and forgets everything. So she starts her day new each day, but she still has great success in life. And I just love the story.
Yeah, that's an amazing movie.
It is an amazing movie.
If you could travel anywhere in the world, where would you go and what's the first thing you would do when you got there?
If I could travel anywhere in the world, I have always wanted to go to Italy. And there's so many places I would want to see. And I guess maybe now I'm thinking through that, Greece. I think I'm going to say Greece.
Ooh.
And I would like to go to Athens. And the first place I would want to go to is the Parthenon. I just am fascinated by the history. I would love to experience that history in person. Studied a lot about it, and I'm just amazed by the accomplishments of those societies back then and their communities. It's just what they once were, the grandness of what they once were, and the fact that that all ended is fascinating to me. And so one day I hope to see it.
Stay connected for more captivating insights into the exceptional individuals driving innovation at Kno2. Connect, listen, transform. This is Kno2fy with your hosts, Dr. Peter Schoch and Therasa Bell.
Welcome back, everybody, as we wrap today's discussion. Great discussion, really around, I think, one of the most critical pieces now that TEFCA QHIN, I think you started out the conversation. So, okay, we're a QHIN, what now? I think our last podcast that we released right after we were designated as Future of Healthcare Communication is now. We're a QHIN, and now it's, okay, now we're a QHIN, now what? And we talking about adoption today. Therasa, what do you want to leave the audience with, or our listeners with, as any final thoughts around adoption? And I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that we're doing here at Kno2 to try and drive some of that based on our conversation today.
I other than I think it's what information that you're going to get to also is that we're very focused now to as a QHIN personally and working with the other QHINs, what we're spearheading in the market, what we're spearheading technically to get some of these friction points kind of smoothed out. We've been doing that for a while with the other networks. We're going to carry that discipline over into QHIN and help in particular. We're very, very focused to our electronic health record vendor partners because it's kind of the catalyst for information exchange and helping them and helping them technically know how to one, adopt the APIs, but two, think about workflows within their EHR.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And the last two things I'd leave you with are right around those areas there. We talked a lot about the workflow, separating the workflow from a workflow around the network and how the network delivers a payload appropriately that needs to be informed by the clinical workflows and then ultimately feed into the clinical workflows that the EHRs need to help build around. To that end, I think making sure that we have our ear on the ground as interoperability partners of what provider end users need, what their workflows are going to be critical to our success in that regard. And so as we go through the next several months, standing up our clinical advisory councils across the sectors and disciplines that are common in healthcare will really help us to make sure that we're building to those ends. And then secondly, and this is something you and I talked about, and I'll throw a teaser out here. I'd like to not talk about these things in isolation. We were blessed to have Mickey Tripathi join us, and we're hoping to have Epic come join us on the conversation. This isn't about selling something in our regard, but I'd like to have a conversation with all the QHINs. I'd like us all to talk about the common things. We're all going to have different challenges, different business models, different bents on things. But there are a number of common things that we can talk about driving forward in. And I'd love to have some of those conversations. So just a hint, you might see an invite. If you're another QHIN listening, you will see an invite come out to join us on the podcast to have a conversation around these things. Again, not trying to reveal any competitive business secrets, but just trying to make sure that we educate, that we're all addressing the right critical things that drive adoption, because adoption is going to benefit everybody in the process. So I think that's it for me, Teresa. Those are a couple of the big things. Yep. Guys, thanks so much. We'll see you next time on Kno2fy. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us today. That's a wrap for this episode. Please subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform to make sure you don't miss an episode. Get Kno2 connected today and set yourself and your organization free to unlock your potential. For more information on the value of being Kno2 connected, visit us at www.kno2.com. Follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. Connect, listen, transform.